The Cold War was reflected in culture through music, movies, books, television, and other media, as well as sports and social beliefs and behavior. One major element of the Cold War was the threat of a nuclear war. Another was espionage. Many works use the Cold War as a backdrop, or directly take part in fictional conflict between the U.S. and the U.S.S.R. The period 1953–62 saw Cold War themes first enter the mainstream culture as a public preoccupation. For the historical context in America, see United States in the 1950s. Fiction, spy stories, cloak and dagger stories became part of the popular culture of the Cold War in both East and West, with innumerable novels and movies that showed how polarized and dangerous the world was. Soviet audiences thrilled at spy stories showing how the KGB agents protected the motherland by foiling dirty work by America's nefarious CIA, Britain's devious MI6, and Israel's devilish Mossad. After 1963, Hollywood increasingly depicted the CIA as clans of villains. Books and other works: So Last Babylon by Pat Frank, Art Light by Eric L. Harry, Bert Vidar betrayed Elsa Anders Jacobson and Soren Olsen, features Bert travel with his family to New York City in July 1989, but fearing United States agents arriving to Oreskoga to prevent him from going to the USA, as he has fallen in love with Paulina, whose cousin Pavel has arrived to Sweden from Czechoslovakia, and Bert has been talking to Pavel. Cat's Cradle by Kurt Vonnegut. Good Morning Comrades by Onjaki, a novel about a young boy in Luanda, Angola, and the end of the Cold War. Resurrection Day by Brendan Dubois. Twilight 2000 role-playing game. War Day by Whitley Strieber and James Kunetka. Red Storm Rising, a 1986 novel by Tom Clancy, about a conventional NATO, Warsaw Pact war. Other Tom Clancy novels which are part of the Jack Ryan universe, most especially The Hunt for Red October and The Cardinal of the Kremlin, though all of his books from this era are featured against a background of East-West conflict. The First Team by John Dudley Ball. 1973, a story of United States capitulation to the USSR by a weak president and the group that overthrows the occupying government. 1984 by George Orwell. Spy vs. Spy. Frederick Forsyth's spy novels sold in the hundreds of thousands. The Fourth Protocol, whose title refers to a series of conventions that, if broken, will lead to nuclear war, and that are now, of course, all broken except for the fourth and last thread, was made into a major film starring British actor Michael Caine. The Manchurian Candidate by Richard Condon took a different approach and portrayed a communist conspiracy against the USA, acting not through leftists or pacifists but through a thinly veiled allusion to Joe McCarthy. The logic of this was that if McCarthyists were accusing so many people of being communist agents, it could only be to divert attention from the real communists. The theme of collusion between international communists and Western rightists would be picked up again by many movies or television shows, which would feature an alliance between power-hungry communists attacking the free world from without and profit-driven capitalists undermining it for financial gain. Sacrifice by Graham Masterton. Masters of Deceit, a non-fiction work written by the FBI, through J. Edgar Hoover's office, extolling the vices of communism and the virtues of Americanism. Glasnost radically changed Russian culture, as books that had been forbidden suddenly became available, and people were reading them all the time, everywhere. Cinema. Cinema as early Cold War propaganda. During the Cold War, films functioned as a means to influence and control public opinion internally. The United States and the Soviet Union invested heavily in propaganda designed to influence the hearts and minds of people around the world, especially using motion pictures. Cold War films produced by both sides attempted to address different facets of the superpower conflict and sought to influence both domestic and foreign opinion. The gap between American and Soviet film gave the Americans a distinct advantage over the Soviet Union. America was readily prepared to utilize the cinematic achievements as a way to effectively impact the public opinion in a way the Soviet Union could not. Cinema, Americans hoped, would help close the gap caused by Soviet development of nuclear weapons and advancements in space technology. The use of film as an effective form of widespread propaganda transformed cinema into another Cold War battlefront. U.S. cinema. The Americans took advantage of the pre-existing cinematic advantage over the Soviet Union, using movies as another way to create the communist enemy. In the early years of the Cold War, 70 explicitly anti-communist films were released. American films incorporated a wide scale of Cold War themes and issues into all genres of film, which gave American motion pictures a particular lead over Soviet film. Despite the audience's lack of zeal for anti-communist, Cold War-related cinema, the films produced evidently did serve as successful propaganda in both America and the U.S.S.R. The films released during this time received a response from the Soviet Union, which subsequently released its own array of films to combat the depiction of the communist threat. Several organizations played a key role in ensuring that Hollywood acted in the national best interest of the U.S. Catholic Legion of Decency and the Production Code Administration acted as two conservative groups that controlled a great deal of the national repertoire during the early stages of the Cold War. These groups filtered out politically subversive or morally questionable movies, more blatantly illustrating the shift from cinema as an art form to cinema as a form of strategic weapon. The Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals ensured that filmmakers adequately expressed the patriotism. Beyond these cinema-specific efforts, the FBI played a surprisingly large role in the production of movies, instituting her triangular-shaped film strategy. FBI set up a surveillance operation in Hollywood, made efforts to pinpoint and blacklist communists, secretly laundered intelligence through HUAC, and further helped in producing movies that fostered image as the protector of the American people. Quote, the FBI additionally endorsed films, including Oscar winner The Hoaxsters. In the 1960s, Hollywood began using spy films to create the enemy through film. Previously, the influence of the Cold War could be seen in many, if not all, genres of American film. By the 1960s, spy films were effectively a weapon of confrontation between the two world systems. Quote, both sides heightened paranoia and created a sense of constant unease in viewers through the increased production of spy films. Film depicted the enemy in a way that caused both sides to increase general suspicion of foreign and domestic threat. USSR Cold War cinema. Between 1946 to 54, the Soviet Union mimicked the U.S. adoption of cinema as a weapon. The Central United Film Studios and the Committee on Cinema Affairs were committed to the Cold War battle. Under Stalin's rule, movies could only be made within strict confines. Cinema and government were, as it stood, inextricably linked. Many films were banned for being insufficiently patriotic. Nonetheless, the Soviet Union produced a plethora of movies with the aim to blatantly function as negative propaganda. In the same fashion as the United States, the Soviets were eager to depict their enemy in the most unflattering light possible. Between 1946 and 1950, 45.6% of on-screen villains in Soviet films were either American or British. Films addressed non-Soviet themes that emerged in American film in an attempt to derail the criticism and paint the U.S. as the enemy. Attacks made by the United States against the U.S.S.R. were simply used as material by Soviet filmmakers for their own attacks on the U.S. Soviet cinema during this time took its liberty with history. Did the Red Army engage in the mass rapes of German women and pillage German art treasures, factories, and forests? In Soviet cinema, the opposite was true. This demonstrated the heightened paranoia of the Soviet Union. Despite efforts made to elevate the status of cinema, such as changing the Committee of Cinema Affairs to the Ministry of Cinematography, cinema did not seem to work as invigorating propaganda as was planned. Although the anti-American films were notably popular with audiences, the ministry did not feel the message had reached the general public, perhaps due to the fact that the majority of moviegoers seeing the films produced were, perhaps, the Soviets most likely to admire American culture. After Stalin's death, a main administration of cinema affairs replaced the ministry, allowing the filmmakers more freedom due to the lack of direct government control. Many of the films released throughout the late 1950s and 1960s focused on spreading a positive image of Soviet life, intent to prove that Soviet life was indeed better than American life. Russian science fiction emerged from a prolonged period of censorship in 1957, opened up by de-Stalinization and real Soviet achievements in the space race, typified by Ivan Afomov's galactic epic, Andromeda. Official communist science fiction transposed the laws of historical materialism to the future, scorning Western nihilistic writings and predicting a peaceful transition to universal communism. Scientocratic visions of the future nevertheless implicitly critiqued the bureaucratically developed socialism of the present. Dissident science fiction writers emerged, such as the Strugatsky brothers, Boris and Arkady, with their social fantasies, problematizing the role of intervention in the historical process, or Stanislaw Lem's tongue-in-cheek exposures of man's cognitive limitations. Films depicting nuclear war. The 1959 film On the Beach depicted a gradually dying, post-apocalyptic world in Australia that remained after a nuclear Third World War. Other films include Duck and Cover, a 1951 educational movie explaining what to do in the event of a nuclear attack, Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, a black comedy film that satirizes the Cold War and the threat of nuclear warfare. Fail-Safe, a film based on a novel of the same name about an American bomber crew and nuclear tensions. The War Game depicts the effects of a nuclear war in Britain following a conventional war that escalates to nuclear war. Damnation Alley, surprise attack launched on the United States, and the subsequent efforts of a small band of survivors in California to reach another group of survivors in Albany, New York. The children's story short film, which originally aired on TV's Mobile Showcase, depicts the first day of indoctrination of an elementary school classroom by a new teacher, representing a totalitarian government that has taken over the United States. It is based on the 1960 short story of the same name by James Clavell. The day after, this made-for-television movie by ABC that depicts the consequences of a nuclear war in Lawrence, Kansas and the surrounding area. War Games, about a young computer hacker who unknowingly hacks into a defense computer and risks starting a nuclear war. Testament depicts the after effects of a nuclear war in a town near San Francisco, California. Countdown to Looking Glass, a film that presents a simulated news broadcast about a nuclear war. Threads, a film that is set in the British city of Sheffield and shows the long-term results of a nuclear war on the surrounding area. The Sacrifice, a philosophical drama about nuclear war. The Manhattan Project, though not about a nuclear war, it was seen as a cautionary tale. When the Wind Blows, an animated film about an elderly British couple in a post-nuclear war world. Miracle Mile, a film about two lovers in Los Angeles leading up to a nuclear war. By Dawn's Early Light, about rogue Soviet military officials framing NATO for a nuclear attack in order to spark a full-blown nuclear war. On the Beach, a remake of the 1959 film Fail-Safe, a remake of the 1964 film. Films depicting a conventional U.S.-U.S.S.R. war. In addition to fears of a nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, there were also fears of a direct, large-scale conventional conflict between the two superpowers. Invasion U.S.A., a 1952 film showed a Soviet invasion of the U.S.A. succeeding because the citizenry had fallen into moral decay, war profiteering, and isolationism. The film was later parodied on Mystery Science Theater 3000. Red Nightmare, a 1962 government-sponsored short subject narrated by Jack Webb, imagined a Soviet-dominated America as a result of the protagonist's negligence of his all-American duties. World War III, a 1982 NBC miniseries about a Soviet invasion of Alaska. Red Dawn presented a conventional Soviet attack with limited, strategic Soviet nuclear strikes on the United States, aided by allies from Latin America, and the exploits of a group of high schoolers who form a guerrilla group to oppose them. Invasion U.S.A. This film depicts a Soviet agent leading Latin American communist guerrillas launching attacks in the United States, and an ex-CIA agent played by Chuck Norris opposing him and his mercenaries. America, a peaceful takeover of the United States by the Soviet Union. Films depicting Cold War espionage. Firefox is a 1982 film based on a Craig Thomas novel of the same name. The plot details an American plot to steal a highly advanced Soviet fighter aircraft which is capable of Mach 6, is invisible to radar, and carries weapons controlled by thought. The Hunt for Red October is a 1990 film based on a Tom Clancy novel of the same name about the captain of a technologically advanced Soviet ballistic missile submarine that attempts to defect to the United States. James Bond first appeared in 1953. While the primary antagonists in the majority of the novels were Soviet agents, the films were only vaguely based on the Cold War. The Bond movies followed the political climate of the time in their depictions of Soviets and Red Chinese. In the 1954 version of Casino Royale, Bond was an American agent working with the British to destroy a ruthless Soviet agent in France, but became more widely known as Agent 007, James Bond, of Her Majesty's Secret Service, who was played by Sean Connery until 1971 and by several actors since. Although Bond films often used the Cold War as a backdrop, the Soviet Union itself was almost never Bond's enemy, that role being more often left to fictional and apolitical criminal organizations. However, Red China was in league with Bond's enemies in the films Goldfinger, You Only Live Twice and The Man with the Golden Gun, while some later movies featured a rogue Soviet general as the enemy. Tasupolnomochen Zayavit, a Soviet TV series based on Julian Semenov's novel. The plot of the movie is set around fictional African country Nagonia, where CIA agents are preparing a military coup, while KGB agent Slavin is trying to prevent it. Slav and succeeds by blackmailing the corrupt American spy John Glebe. The Falcon and the Snowman is a 1985 film directed by John Schlesinger about two young American men, Christopher Boyce and Dalton Lee, who sold U.S. security secrets to the Soviet Union. The film is based upon the 1979 book The Falcon and the Snowman, a true story of friendship and espionage by Robert Lindsay. Gotcha is a film about a college student named Jonathan who plays a game called Gotcha in which he hunts and is hunted by other students with paint guns. On campus, Jonathan goes to France on vacation, meets a beautiful woman named Sasha, travels with her to East Germany, and unknowingly becomes involved in the spy game between the USA and USSR. Other films about U.S.-Soviet fears and rivalry. The Third Man, a major subplot, deals with the refugee status of a Czechoslovakian woman, and the Russian attempts to deport her back to Czechoslovakia. The Russians Are Coming, a film about a Soviet submarine that accidentally runs aground near a small New England town. Telephone, a film starring Charles Bronson and Donald Pleasance about the net of deep-cover sleeper agents in the USA who are being activated by the deserted KGB agent Rocky IV. In this installment of the Rocky saga, Rocky Balboa has to fight an extremely powerful boxer from the Soviet Union. Spies Like Us, a comedy film starring Dan Aykroyd and Chevy Chase as decoy agents sent to infiltrate the Soviet Union. Ruskies, a movie about a Soviet Navy sailor who washes ashore in Florida and is befriended by three American boys. Project X, a film starring Matthew Broderick where a U.S. airman works with chimpanzees on Cold War-related projects. Television, The A-Team, Airwolf, Danger Man, I Led Three Lives, the first foray into mass culture dealing with the Cold War. I Spy, Get Smart, MacGyver, The Man from U.N.C. Ellie, Mission Impossible, Quatermass 2. Several episodes of Star Trek featured a futuristic version of the Cold War, in terms of the United Federation of Planets versus the Klingon Empire and the Romulan Star Empire, analogues for the USA, the U.S.S.R. and the PRC, respectively. A Taste of Armageddon also showed the concept of mad in a war between opposing sides. Scarecrow and Mrs. King, Ivan the Terrible 1976 sitcom, The Rocky and Bullwinkle Show 1960s cartoon for children and adults where the villains are Boris and Natasha, who were both Soviets. The Sandbaggers, The Twilight Zone, a number of episodes of which depicted fallout shelters, such as the 1961 episode The Shelter, produced is a social commentary on the civil defense push during the Berlin crisis of 1961, and the 1987 Ronald Reagan-era Shelter Skelter. Twilight Zone episodes commenting on other aspects of the Cold War and world peace include the 1986 A Small Talent for War. Television commercials. Wendy's hamburger chain ran a television commercial showing a supposed Soviet fashion show which featured the same large, unattractive woman wearing the same dowdy outfit in a variety of situations, the only difference being the accessories she carried. This was supposedly a lampoon on how the Soviet society is characterized with uniformity and standardization, in contrast to the U.S. characterized with freedom of choice, as highlighted in the Wendy's commercial. Apple Computers 1984 ad, despite paying homage to George Orwell's novel of the same name, follows a more serious yet ambitious take on the freedom versus totalitarianism theme evident between the U.S. and Soviet societies at the time. Political commercials. Daisies and Mushroom Clouds. Daisy was the most famous campaign commercial of the Cold War. aired only once, on 7 September 1964, it was a factor in Lyndon B. Johnson's defeat of Barry Goldwater in the 1964 presidential election. The contents of the commercial were controversial, and their emotional impact was searing. The commercial opens with a very young girl standing in a meadow with chirping birds, slowly counting the petals of a daisy as she picks them one by one. Her sweet innocence, along with mistakes in her counting, endear her to the viewer. When she reaches 9, an ominous-sounding male voice is suddenly heard intoning the countdown of a rocket launch. As the girl's eyes turn towards something she sees in the sky, the camera zooms in until one of her pupils fills the screen, blacking it out. The countdown reaches 0, and the blackness is instantly replaced by a simultaneous bright flash and thunderous sound, which is then followed by footage of a nuclear explosion. An explosion similar in appearance to the near-surface burst Trinity test of 1945, followed by another cut to footage of a billowing mushroom cloud. As the fireball ascends, an edit cut is made, this time to a close-up section of incandescence in the mushroom cloud, over which a voiceover from Johnson is played, which states emphatically, "These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other, or we must die." Another voiceover then says, "Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home." Bear in the Woods. Bear in the Woods was a 1984 campaign advertisement endorsing Ronald Reagan for president. This campaign ad depicted a brown bear wandering through the woods and suggested that Reagan was more capable of dealing with the Soviets than his opponent. In spite of the fact that the ad never explicitly mentioned the Soviet Union, the Cold War of Walter Mondale. Humor. The 1984 "We Begin Bombing in 5 Minutes" incident is an example of Cold War dark humor. It was a personal microphone gaffe joke between Ronald Reagan, his White House staff and radio technicians that was accidentally leaked to the U.S. populace. At the time, Reagan was well known before this incident for telling Soviet-Russian jokes in televised debates, many of which have now been uploaded to video hosting websites. My fellow Americans, I'm pleased to tell you today that I've signed legislation that will outlaw Russia forever. We begin bombing in 5 minutes. The joke was a parody of the opening line of the day's speech. My fellow Americans, I'm pleased to tell you that today I signed legislation that will allow student religious groups to begin enjoying a right they've too long been denied: the freedom to meet in public high schools during non-school hours, just as other student groups are allowed to do. Following his trip to Los Angeles in 1959 and being refused entry into Disneyland on security grounds, a dejected Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev joked, "Just now I was told that I could not go to Disneyland. I asked, why not? What is it? Do you have rocket launching pads there?" Arts. The United States and the Soviet Union engaged in a competition in the arts as well. Cultural competition was fought out in Moscow, New York, London and Paris. The Russians excelled at ballet and chess, the Americans at jazz and abstract expressionist paintings. The U.S. funded its ballet troops, and both used ballet as political propaganda, and they used dance to reflect lifestyle in the battle for the hearts and minds of men. The defection of a premier dancer became a major coup. From 1956 through the late 1970s, the U.S. State Department sent its finest jazz musicians to show off music that appealed to youth, to demonstrate racial harmony at home, and to undergird freedom, as jazz was a democratic music form, free-flowing and improvised. Jazz tours of the Soviet Union were organized in 1956, and lasted through the 1970s. Chess gas was inexpensive enough, and the Russians always won until America unleashed Bobby Fischer. Vastly more expensive was the space race, as a proxy for scientific supremacy. As well, when it came to sports, the two countries both competed in the Olympics during the Cold War period, which also created severe tension when the West boycotted the first Russian Olympics in 1980. Stephen J. Whitfield writes in his article titled "The Cultural Cold War as History" that these two nations were not fighting the cultures against each other, but more onto their own citizens. As well, that many things that were going on during the Cold War were purely done as an intent to create fear among African Americans, especially within the United States.